Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan and I'm joined by Raf Manji, who's a strategy and risk consultant these days, but as a former investment banker going back a few years, and also a former Christchurch City Councillor who chaired the strategy and finance committee in Christchurch for some time. Look, Raf, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. Now, you've always had very strong views on monetary and fiscal policy, so I thought we could talk about that. But also, I thought it would be really interesting to pick up on some learnings from Christchurch, I guess, post-earthquakes, in terms of how they can help us work out what we should be doing in response to coronavirus as well. But if we kick off on the monetary policy side, so New Zealand's now, we've got quantitative easing, we've got the Reserve Bank buying government bonds and local government bonds in the secondary market. Now, you've been a strong proponent of the Reserve Bank funding the government directly by buying bonds from Treasury and using this money to fund infrastructure, the real economy, so to speak, rather than going through the banking system. Now, there's been a bit of speculation that this may actually happen, and Adrian Orr, the Reserve Bank Governor, and Finance Minister Grant Robertson have been asked about it and they haven't ruled it out. Why do you think this is the approach that we should be taking?
I mean, there's two reasons for QE, essentially. One is a liquidity issue, to make sure that banks have the liquidity needed to continue lending into the economy. And after the GFC, that was a huge concern in the US because the banking system was falling over. And once Lehman's had actually gone under, that's when they brought out the $700-800 billion funding package, and they realized also in Europe they needed to support the banks, because if the banks fell over, they were in real trouble. So liquidity is really important. Now, that's not really an issue in New Zealand because the banks are very well capitalized, we know that. But it just provides them with that excess credit ability to make new loans. Now, the reason that I've said that's really not the way to go is that the demand for loans is really what drives credit growth. Now, you can have interest rates as low as you like, and obviously, probably interest rates do need to be lower, and we can come to that later. But if people are in a situation where they are financially stressed, they may be losing their jobs, they're carrying a lot of debt, they're not going to be borrowing more money. And this is exactly what we saw in the US between 2008 and 10. And that's when people started to say, actually, maybe this policy is not working. And then when they started buying corporate bonds, saying, oh, well, corporates are then going to use that money to invest back into production and new investment. Actually, a lot of corporates did share buybacks. And we've seen that over the last 10 years. I mean, a lot of the rise in S&P is corporate share buybacks because they've had so much cash. So from my perspective, my interest really is much more in the public sector. The private sector will take care of itself. But in terms of the funding required for the public sector, we should do that in the cheapest way possible. So why should we be bothered about paying market rates for financing when we can fund it ourselves? So you can fund it two ways. You can either fund it by the central bank buying bonds directly from the Treasury. We've seen the Fed do that. We've seen the Bank of Japan do it. In fact, the Bank of Japan have been doing it for 20 plus years. They've only hit inflation of 2% once, and that's when they raised sale tax one month, and then they cut it the next month, because obviously that was a silly idea. And so you can do that in unlimited quantities, but the fact is you can do it at 0%. So we know that we can fund ourselves at 0%, and we're in a low interest rate environment anyway, so there's no reason why we shouldn't do that. The other option is through an overdraft, which we saw recently in the UK with the Ways and Means Committee, where actually the central bank can literally, I mean, what they call in the US, mint the coin. They can basically give the Treasury a $1 billion note and say, where you go and spend it. The thing about that I like is it's not classified as debt, so it doesn't bring you into those issues. It becomes part of the permanent money supply, as opposed to really what is an asset swap. So, the QE process in terms of liquidity for the banks is essentially an asset swap. It's swapping bank reserves for bonds, gives banks the ability to lend more money, but it doesn't always flow through to the system. So from my perspective, the private sector will take care of itself, and there's a lot going on in that area. But in terms of the public sector, we have got work to do, and we want to fund that in the cheapest and the quickest way possible. That doesn't mean that we can't still have the central bank participating in the bond market, but it doesn't have to do all of its bond purchasing for the government in the bond market. It can do it directly.
Okay, so I mean, if this is such a good idea, why haven't we done it before, or have we done it before, and when?
Well, we haven't done any of this before. So QE is a good idea in a financially stressed time like this. So it's really, I mean, people have talked a lot in the last few years about the Overton window. So the ability for, or the time at which a policy ultimately becomes acceptable. So it moves into a window, everyone can see it and goes, oh, that's a great idea. But when it's outside the window, everyone thinks it's barking mad. And we saw, you know, what happened to Russell Norman back in, I don't know, 2011, 2012, when he talked about, I think, $2 billion for Christchurch. I'd made the same policy proposal as well. Actually, I think I was on the, talking of 7 Sharp, was on with Heather the first week they ran a story down here in Christchurch about that. And she was saying to me, what, you mean they can just kind of create the money out of nothing? I said, yeah, they can. So I was calling for a $5 billion government-funded injection to fund the earthquake rebuild process, and it would have been fantastic. So why ideas are not accepted are simply down to beliefs in the system. And what you will see is a lot of people have been talking about this for years, and now they'll go, oh, we've been talking about this for years, but it just for some reason has not hit the mainstream and become believable. I mean, Thomas Kuhn talked about this in the paradigm of scientific paradigm shifts, scientific revolutions, that it takes a certain variety of circumstances to all be present at the same time for a major paradigm shift to happen. And they do happen, and they happen very suddenly. So for people in the policy world who are pushing policies and nothing happens, and then one day it does happen, it's quite difficult because you never know when that moment's going to come. So in terms of why hasn't it been done before, it's because one, people in charge, policymakers, didn't really understand the system that they were operating. There wasn't the immediate driver in terms of a crisis. And often these big changes come after a crisis or a war or a famine or a disaster. And the people who did know about it weren't able to access the levers of power, and probably for those reasons. So it's just the way the system works. I just think we just have to accept that.
Yeah, look, we're certainly in extraordinary times at the moment. So look, if we do go ahead in New Zealand and we get the Reserve Bank buying government bonds direct from Treasury at 0%, I mean, is this effectively costless central bank funding? I mean, are there no downsides to this? What does it mean for the New Zealand dollar, the government deficit?
It makes no difference. It still will be regarded as a debt on the government's books. And theoretically, it still needs to be paid back. The main difference is the financing. So we don't need to pay interest on it, so why should we? So that's saving some money. So let's do that. It doesn't mean that the Reserve Bank still won't participate in the normal secondary bond market. It can do bits of both, but we'll save some money. What happens in the future is when we talk about things like monetization or sterilization, at some point in the future, depending on monetary conditions at the time, depending on where inflation is, depending on where other economic indicators are, the government may not pay that off. So it may just become part of the permanent debt. And at some point, the Reserve Bank may just wipe it. So that's the monetization aspect of it. But you don't need to actually answer that question right now. The main issue now is that it reduces the interest cost for the government. So if it's for public spending, that's absolutely appropriate. And the secondary market will continue as it is. In fact, what I'd like to see the Reserve Bank do is get more aggressive in the yield curve, especially out to 3, even 5 years, and bring that down to 0. And I think this could help that happen. So if they start buying 3-5-year bonds off the Treasury directly with a 0% coupon, it will actually force those interest rates down. And of course, they can cut the OCR to 0. They can cut the OCR below 0 as well. So, remember, there's 2 issues. There's liquidity, which is making sure that credit is available in the economy, banks are well capitalized, and there's the cost of the financing of all this expenditure. and bringing interest rates down as well, because interest rates are still quite high in real terms.
So I mean, if we go ahead and do this, and even if we don't, we're looking at a long period of very low interest rates, possibly negative interest rates. And you mentioned Japan before. Is that our future?
It could well be. I mean, I think there are three futures in some respects. There's the US version, there's the European version, there's the Japanese version. The Japanese version, which is interesting for me because I traded the yen a lot back in the 90s, the currency, but also Japanese government bonds, JGBs. And actually one of my sort of two big losing trades that I remember quite well in that period was being short JGBs. And that's because the Japanese were printing money like crazy. And I thought, well, this is great. You know, clearly bonds are going to go down. I had a short position for many years, actually. And they just kept going up and up and up. And so it caused me to really investigate what was going on, speaking to people at Ministry of Finance in Japan, the Bank of Japan, and other specialists over there to try and understand what they were doing. And that's actually what led me to really investigate the monetary transmission mechanism in the government bond market. And so Japan has been ahead. And if you think about the Nikkei peaked around 91, 40,000 and came off. And Japan has been in a bit of a slump since then. But the economy has actually still been functioning very well. It hasn't had a lot of inflation, hasn't had a lot of growth. And Japan is what I regard as a highly advanced but post-consumer society. The birth rate has dropped. They don't have a lot of immigration, and it's probably what you get without having immigration coming into your country. So the birth rate has come down, but people are still well off. It's quite a high standard of living, and everyone seems reasonably happy. There are a lot of social issues that are worth investigating, but from a financial perspective, that growth imperative is not driving the interest rate anymore. So interest rates have pretty much come to zero, and the cost of money is nothing. In Europe, you have a problem with the inability to write off bad debt. So the Europeans, because of the euro and the EU structure, have been unable to wipe debts from bad banks since the GFC. And because they don't have full fiscal integration, they're just completely kicking the can down the road the whole time. So countries like Greece and Italy, they can't devalue and they can't write off their debt, and they're kind of stuck in this horrible box. And I think inflation is 0.4%, and there's again spending money like no tomorrow. The ECB is supplying unlimited funds. They have a pandemic emergency purchase program, another 750 billion euros, but they're structurally stuck in this terrible conflict between full political integration, which actually nobody wants, and the pain of actually unwinding the euro. And I don't know where that's going to end up. My guess is the euro will unwind at some point, because I just cannot see politically them making the next leap. And then you have the US, where a lot of the, let's say, wealth benefits have gone to the wealthy. So you've had to kind of trickle up, because actually a lot of the banks and the corporates have been supported, but mainstream America and the real economy has not been supported. So you've got these three slightly different models of a kind of very laissez-faire, let's support the corporates, and Wall Street. Europe, which is sort of the old world, sort of mired in a structure that doesn't work anymore. And then Japan, which is a kind of post-consumer, demographically driven society. And then New Zealand, which is a very small economy, which has a lot going for itself because of its ability to produce food. And our agricultural sector is going to become a lot more important in the future. But we've got a very unsophisticated financial system, which is really good. And that's why we didn't have a lot of impacts in the GFC. And we want to kind of keep it like that. So there are some good lessons out there, but we need to be nimble. We need to be practical and still observe the same principles. But I'm reasonably positive when compared to those other areas.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, we've got quantitative easing underway now, and if we do take this next step with the RBNZ buying directly off Treasury, that ramps it up further. Is this a sort of treadmill? Once you're on it, you can't really get off? I mean, I think of the US, and obviously the Fed was unwinding QE there, and then this hit. And I think last I looked, which was a week or so ago, the Fed's balance sheet was over 6 trillion, and people are talking about it going to 10, 20 trillion.
Yeah.
So is this a treadmill that you can never get off once you're on it?
History would show us that this is actually the future, is right here now. And that's why the Japanese experience is so important to understand, not just from a financial perspective, but from an economic and social perspective. And that, you notice I don't lump finance in with the economic and social, because finance is a different beast altogether. And that's why a lot of macroeconomic models don't work, because they don't have money in there in the right way. And I think that's what we've been learning over the last 10 to 20 years, is that money plays a specific role in the economy. But yeah, I mean, the US experience is interesting. If you remember, I think, I don't know, 2010, 2011, everyone was going on about the national debt in the US. And remember, Congress was shutting down the whole time. And I think the national debt was going to be 10 trillion, 11 trillion. And the world was going to end, according to the Republicans. It's now 24 trillion. And the world has not ended yet. And it's probably going to go to 29 trillion, because actually it doesn't really matter. The debt sits in the economy somewhere. Either it's on the public balance sheet or the private balance sheet. It's actually the stock of money in the system. So someone's got to own it. And I think when I look back on the last...
Does anyone ever have to pay it back, I guess?
No, because it is the stock of money in the economy. So let's say we all that debt gets paid back. The money stock contracts. So the way the monetary system is designed is actually you need new debt coming into the system. And that's the role of the commercial banks, is to create new debt. So every time they create a loan, that creates the deposit, which is the other side of the bookkeeping entry. And the money stock grows. And then, of course, you've got the velocity of money circulating around the economy. But if we stop creating money, that whole thing stops and the economy contracts. And I think we have to be very careful in a situation that we're in now to not get too carried away, with everyone cutting salaries and all this kind of stuff, because austerity doesn't work. It shrinks the economy and actually leads to very poor outcomes, especially for lower income and lower socioeconomic people. So I don't think we have to worry about it. We just have to know that if inflation were to rise, it's easy enough to drain that money back out of the system. And you can drain it out the same way that we do it now. You issue more bonds, so you drain liquidity out of the system, or you raise taxes. But the real question is that going to happen? It is hard to see that we're going to be in a high inflationary environment, certainly not caused by monetary issues. If inflation comes like it did in the 70s, it will come through a commodity shock and probably won't hit New Zealand because we don't have food issues. So in a way, we become, the Saudi Arabia of the 1970s, where we have a commodity that the rest of the world needs. And that's good quality food. We provide or produce enough food, I think, to feed 40 million people. So that now becomes even more important. And our stewardship of our food production systems becomes something that we want to invest even more in, to raise those attribute values of quality and value.
Look, that's all fascinating, and we could go on talking about these issues all day. But we'll move on to, I guess, what learnings there are from Christchurch. Obviously, primarily, I'm thinking of the earthquakes and the response to the earthquakes, the rebuilding, every aspect of it, really. I mean, the trauma and tragedy that human suffering, etc., to the rebuilding of the city. I mean, there are some parallels, I guess, with the crisis that coronavirus is causing. What are the sort of key ones you see, and what sort of learnings are there?
Yeah, it is like a microcosm. Even though it's a natural disaster, it's had similar impacts. I mean, a lot of people who've been writing about Christchurch actually are not from Christchurch, which always irritates us down here a little bit. So this is a great opportunity to talk about it. That we had the central city was cordoned off for 2 years. We had military on the streets here. So you had places you couldn't go. We didn't have swimming pools. So even though we could congregate together, we had 18 months of ground shaking, and we had businesses shut down. We had the wage subsidy, which worked really well. We had a lot of people working from home, and it took us a long, we had kids not at school. And, for all those parents out there who are worried about NCAs, don't worry about it. You know, really, if you ask kids here now who did, you know, were teenagers in 2011 in Christchurch, you go, oh yeah, that was okay. You know, we had some derived grades, some stuff we didn't worry about. It's, you know, it is an opportunity to do other things and to learn other things, to change habits. So we experienced a lot of those social issues that we're experiencing now, and the economic ones. And I think the impact of insurance and all the insurance claims that some people still have today had a huge impact. So it had a huge impact. So in a way, if you take people trying to rebuild their houses in the same way as people trying to rebuild their businesses, you're going to have exactly the same issues. You know, do I get an insurance payout? How can I get my house rebuilt, or how can I get my business back off the ground? Do I need to leave it? Do I need to take the money and move on? People will experience those same issues, and the mental health impact is going to be huge. I mean, we're still dealing with that down here, still dealing with that issue, and we've had an underfunded district health board down here because the Ministry of Health was just terrible to deal with. And with all the great work that the Director General is doing now, let's not forget the Ministry of Health was not in great shape, you know, as we came to the end of last year. So the DHBs, and I think Heather Simpson did a report on that, that's the Ministry of Health is going to need a lot of work because the mental health impacts are going to be enormous. And the lessons, I think, from Christchurch need to be learned, that you need to provide the appropriate help to people, and you need to try and help people back on their feet. I mean, I saw the Minister of Finance talking about the small business loan today, direct from the government. Brilliant. At 0%, that's exactly what you need. You need cheap funding to let people just get some cash back into the business and work things out. Now, obviously, they tried to go through the banks, didn't quite work. Well, of course not. The banks are not a charity. So, you know, it's not that easy to get money out of the banks. Now they've gone this other way. Perfect. Now, if we had a proper public bank, we'd be able to do that a lot quicker. And I think that's something we certainly need to look at. But I mean, another one of the bigger lessons from Christchurch is after a crisis, you tend to get everyone coming out with their visions for the new society and a new way of doing things. And most of those will not happen. I'm sorry to disappoint people, but they're good to talk about. And you'll have, you know, we had a TEDx conference and you have webinars and all the rest of it. What we do need to do is not have delusions of grandeur, of big projects, of stuff that sounds great, but you know what, very difficult to get off the ground. What was done well here was rebuilding horizontal infrastructure. You know, so the SKIRT project, bringing an alliance group of contractors together and say, here's the pipeline of work. You can all bid for it, share the pain, share the gain, and get on and do it. And I think the government and the Infrastructure Commission should be ready to go with that. And it's not sexy stuff, but actually if they spent, you know, $10–20 billion on renewing underground pipes, sewerage systems, flooding systems, that would be the best return of money, because it needs to be done. And every single local council around the country has got infrastructure projects backed up, and they don't have the funding because the ratepayer model doesn't work. So this is the chance to finally sort out the funding model between central and local government. And if you've got that money flowing through the economy at that base level, you're supporting the whole economy anyway. It's supporting, you know, but it's at the basic level. So, I mean, don't build convention centres and all that kind of nonsense. It's a complete waste of money. Put the money into the stuff that you know has to be done, and where you have a lot of jobs to be created. And just beware people coming up with grand plans to do stuff. One, they usually cost a lot more than you think, and they're very difficult to deliver. But if you need to replace a sewerage pipe or a water pipe, you know how to do that. It can be done, and it's just a matter of funding. And we can fund this stuff now at nothing. So we will never get a better chance to upgrade our country's infrastructure as now. So that's what I would be focusing on. It's not difficult. So I would be saying, you know, save your time. Don't waste time dreaming up new visions about things. Focus on all the work you do have to do that is actually important, and you can fund it now, provide the jobs, and away you go.
Fantastic. Look, thanks, Raf. That's really interesting stuff. Appreciate your time. That's Raf Manji, who's a strategy and risk consultant, and I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.